All right, today is May 1st, 2026. I'm going to talk about Mayday a little bit because it's very relevant, I think, to our current situation in this country and life in the world at large. 160 countries, not including the United States or Canada, celebrate May 1st as Labor Day. Now, historically, May Day was a day to protest for labor rights way back in the 19th century. Um, and the reason why we do not observe Labor Day on May Day in this country is because, through their grand wisdom, the government decided not to allow it to be assigned to May Day and instead chose a day in September because they didn't want it associated with something called the Haymarket Affair, which occurred in Chicago. In 1887, what happened was, as throughout the rest of the country, there were a bunch of labor protests, and some 3,000 people were protesting in Chicago and in a place called Haymarket Square. And the police, being as they sometimes do, got trigger happy with these labor protesters and fired into the crowd and killed two people and injured a bunch more. Okay. So it set people on edge. Now, the newspaper was a relatively new thing, and the telegraph, I believe, was still around, so they could relay this information pretty quickly. And it set the nation kind of on fire when they heard about these police that killed labor protesters in Chicago. So the protests got larger. And in Chicago again, they gathered in Haymarket. It was a much bigger crowd. And the leaders of that place were making speeches. This is on May 4th now. And the city had had enough. And so they regimented their police and sent them down in a line and told that crowd to disperse. Well, of course, the crowd was like, no, this is our First Amendment right. We're peaceably addressing our uh, you know, grievances with the government, with you guys, the corporations, and all that other stuff. We have a right to be here. The police said, no, you don't. Well, someone in that protesting crowd had a stick of dynamite that they lit and threw at that line of police, and it killed a man and injured a bunch more. Well, then the police opened fire on that crowd again and killed, I believe, another four more protesters and injured another 70, is what the tally was. But what happened in the chaos as those people scattered is the police began to shoot at each other. Six more cops were killed from injuries from revolver bullets that almost all certainly came from their own side. Because chances are pretty good this crowd was not very well armed. Remember the time that we're talking about, right? And while there were probably some that were armed, there probably weren't a lot in that crowd compared to how the police were armed. Police were going to be better equipped. But anyway, this is all documented fact that these people were killed. And in fact, one of the speakers of that particular protest said as much in a testimony. He said, these people were butchered for the sake of the objections of the moneyed class against an 8-hour workday, to stop the 8-hour movement. That's what that was about. So in the United States, in 1894, when they finally implemented Labor Day, they decided to do it in a day completely different from the May Day events that occurred that sparked the reason for them to create that holiday in the first place. Okay. This is not the end of the labor movement, though. 1921 was the Battle of Blair Mountain in West Virginia, with striking miners who had to go to battle, straight up battles. The largest insurrection of the labor movement in this country was in that particular battle, with private corporate forces and Pinkertons and whatever else came out there to make sure those workers got their asses back in the mine. According to what I understand in my own family history, my great-great-grandfather, who was protesting at the Indianapolis rail workers strike, had his knee busted out by a Pinkerton. A couple people died at that protest too. We have forgotten about this in this country. We have. People talk about unions. Half the time they're spouting the propaganda that says, oh, I don't want them taking money from my check for nothing. Now, it is true that some unions became corrupt and they had their own issues. This is true. However, unions in general are supposed to represent the workers' interests as a collective because no one else in the money class is going to hear it without collective action, right? We're going to stop this factory from working. You're not going to get anything out of it until you give us a better shake, right? And the 19th century is plagued with insurrection and violence and civil disruption because of people trying to fight to keep kids out of mines, to be able to have a weekend, to have a living wage and not live in squalor, not to get paid in company scrip, stuff like that. Brutal hours, unsafe working conditions, people dying, you know. The Knights of Columbus, as an aside, was formed as an insurance operation, and that's what it still is first and foremost. It is a life insurance corporate organization that basically was put together by Irish Catholics that you would all pitch in $1 so that if one of you died, the widow would get some of that money, right? Would get a payout of some sort because that happened frequently, and you just being a widow, and an orphan or whatever, your husband was supplying the money for the family, and now he's gone, and those people would be completely left in the lurch, right? This is the kind of thing that they were fighting against even up until the 1920s. Okay, when I was a kid, my grandfather took me to Sears, and we got to Sears. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old. We got to Sears, and there was a picket line there, and he drove up to the driveway of the Sears, and there were people standing in that driveway. They would have let him pass, but they were letting him know we're right here. And he saw that. He saw this line of picketing workers, and he pulled back and drove off. And I was like, "Why aren't we going to Sears?" And he explained it to me. He said these people are objecting to their current working situation, with their contract or whatever, and they've all agreed to band together to stop working until they get a better deal. And as a kid, I understood and he respected it. My grandfather, was I would argue, conservative, certainly by those day standards. He was a military man, very rigid, regimented, hard worker, all that other stuff. But even he recognized, this is collective action, and I'm going to respect it, right? And basically, we don't cross picket lines, is what he told me. We don't cross them because we're respecting those workers and demanding better conditions, and we're not going to patronize that business until they do so, right? And I think about that because that's the first and last time I heard anybody ever actually talk to me about that in a way that made sense to me, that wasn't political. It was just, this is what these people want, and this is what they're doing in order to get it. They're not hurting anybody. They just refuse to work, and they're letting everyone know this company is not doing right by its workers. We won't work until they give us a better deal, right? The last picket line I ever saw, though, in strange contrast, was for the Seattle Times at their factory in Woodinville, and I worked in that area at the time. It was way out there, and these people were striking. But what's interesting is that they were striking over a dying industry. They were demanding better pay, better wage, whatever conditions that they wanted. But the newspaper, I knew firsthand, was dying on the vine because it was an anachronism. It was obsolete. I had once, for a brief time, had a newspaper subscription as an adult, and realized I don't need this. It's just paper that's building up, because I would get my news online. And you get people coming to the door. You want to buy a newspaper subscription? No, I get all my news online. And that was the last time I ever saw a union like that standing up. It's 27 years ago now. The last time I've seen a picket line. Now, it's anecdotal. It's not to say they don't exist. But personally, it's the last time I encountered one. Now, I'm not a romantic in that when I say that, what that means is I don't believe that things were always better in the past, right? There are a lot of good things that are way better now than they were in the 1990s. Um, but objectively speaking, and I say this after much careful consideration and review, things were better in the 90s. And I'll tell you why. Because we were at the cusp of the forefront of a new technological revolution, and they just needed labor. They needed labor like they hadn't needed it in a while. They needed somewhat smart labor. They needed clever people to figure out how to work computers because they were coming online, coming everywhere. Now the computer, among the many things that it disrupted, were things like the mailroom. Okay, so in the reason you have skyscrapers, the which you don't see many get built anymore. I mean, New York City and stuff like that. But the original design of old skyscrapers was designed around the mailroom and the pneumatic tubes that go up and down. And so you would have, or not always pneumatic. That's fancy, but just the tubes that would drop into the mailroom. So the idea was you'd have a bunch of businesses or maybe one company that was all working in close quarters, and you would be able to communicate with the other departments and other companies within the building by dropping your paperwork into the mailroom. The people down there, they'd be getting these huge piles of mail that would be coming in, and they would sort it out, and they'd hand it to couriers that would then take them to floors and drop all this stuff off, right? There's a whole industry built around the mailroom of keeping this communication going. Gone, gone, starting in the 80s and really advancing in the 90s, right? So, first of all, companies began to spread out into the suburbs, like where I was working, because you don't need to be in a skyscraper anymore if everything is communicated electronically. The second part there is that you have one type of entry level job people talked about in the 80s that you still sometimes hear it. You know, he started in the mailroom, right? The mailroom was where you started, and you would learn the organization of companies and stuff like that, and you would climb up somehow, right? Internal promotion. There's another one. It was a time to be a young man, for certain. To be living in that area, in the Puget Sound, in Seattle area, during the mid to late 90s was a perfect time for a schlub like me. I did not graduate high school. I screwed around too much. I didn't really learn in a seminar format. I never have. I could pass the tests and learn all sorts of stuff on my own, but school was a drag, you know, and no one was forcing me to go. That's the thing. I didn't have a very good home life either. It was hard and cold to get to school. I had to walk up these crazy hills and all this other stuff. I just didn't graduate. That's all there is to it. And but I did participate in some interesting classes though, and one of those classes was visual communications, which was how to work camera equipment, which is what got me my first decent job setting up audiovisual equipment, a lot of which for conventions for people that were burgeoning computer industry. We worked a huge convention for when Windows NT4 came out. Microsoft took over the whole convention center, and we had all these breakout rooms. We had to set up and operate a big concert that they had and all this other stuff. I worked there at that time because there was that opportunity. Okay. And then not long after, I went to work for Microsoft indirectly as tech support, and then game studios as tech support, entry level jobs. Every one of which that I got paid a little bit better than the last, always a little bit better. And I just kept doing that until 2009, really, is when I think about that. The most money I ever made was in 2010, though. But I've never, and not even adjusted for inflation, I've never made as much as I did in 2010, 16 years later. Um, because the financial crisis is really what broke everything, I think. At least in my working memory, anyway. Because you hear the story about the Microsoft millionaire, okay? And Neil Stevenson put it best, where he said these snot nosed punks came and moved to the Pacific Northwest thinking they were going to become computer millionaires, and that's exactly what they did. Happened. A new guy. I was on a boat once. This guy's like, "That's the guy who wrote Excel, this huge glass mansion. Here's the guy who wrote the clock for Windows." Like these guys living in mansions on Lake Washington. You know, because they were there at the right moment in time and history, once in a lifetime opportunity to be at Microsoft in the early 90s and get those stock options. And I knew quite a few of those guys. One of them sold all his stock options to buy a motorcycle for $6,000. He could have been a multimillionaire some many times over, and he'd not done that. I knew another dude who cashed out at $10 million from Amazon. So he made a lot of money in the 90s, but he would have been a billionaire today. That's pretty wild to think about, but never can read the future. But for every one of those stories, there's a lot of people who are being displaced, a lot of work that's no longer being done, older folks that have worked a particular line that no longer is relevant. I always think about the guys who like specialized in strange robots at GM, you know, who became experts in the QX 480, articulated arm or something like that. Now that job is somewhere else, and getting the person who works it gets paid a third of what you did, and everything you spent your entire life on now, it's like, what, it's not applicable to anything. This happens throughout history. It does. There's a song from the 1900s, or 1800s rather, the 19th century, and I forget the name of it. God, I just keep forgetting the name of it. But it's about a, a railroad worker who, the job is to make holes in the rock. You would put the dynamite in that would then blow the rock apart. And there was this new design device called a steam drill, which basically had a steam engine on one side and a pneumatic thing, whatever it was, that would make the drill bit turn. And so you could drill into the rock instead of hammer into it. So you didn't have to be as strong, first of all, and you would be quicker with this thing. But this guy's job in the song is being threatened by this thing. He's like, I'm not going to let this steam drill beat me. And so there's a race to get a tunnel built or whatever it is in the song. And he wins, but then he dies. And the machine keeps going on, right? That's true of technology, especially since the Renaissance. You have the printing press, you have, cannon, you have, rifles, a lot of military technology when you think about this stuff. But things that change humanity, the printing press, the actual practical effects of that didn't get felt for another couple generations. It was the 1630s or so when the Gutenberg press was made that kicked all the monks out of scriptorum, but it was the ideas and the literacy and all that other stuff that had spread over the next 40 years that caused the Protestant Reformation. Bloodshed in Europe for 100 years or whatever it is. But you see these disruptions to labor, and there's always this fluctuation of the power of labor versus the power of capital. The Black Plague of Europe, one of the reasons we crawled out of the Dark Ages was the death of about a third of the people in Europe, created this huge labor demand that allowed labor to demand better conditions. They got out of serfdom. They stopped having these contracts that bound them to the land. They became freemen and free farmers and all this other stuff because labor had the power at that time. But it didn't take another, couple hundred years till things were kind of back to squalor again, but people still retain their rights, so to speak. The labor movements of the 1800s were all over, and Mayday was an international thing. And a lot of it had to do with two factors. One is a lot of modern political philosophical thought, Karl Marx being a big one, right? We can't ignore him because he fueled a lot of thought, and he's got points. Now, I don't know what the actual prescription is. He basically describes this utopian future where everybody just shares because that's the way it works. But how you get there is not, it's not really obvious, and of course it's going to be a lot about people. That's what he basically says. It's going to suck getting here, but this is the natural progression. That's what he sees, right? So people were trying to force that issue because they were starting to live in squalor. Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. You know, uh, uh, Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. They talk about the life that people were living inside the cities of the time, and it was awful. You know, you look back in the 1900s or 18th century, 19th century, the 1800s. You know, the idea of the flop house. Flop house was where when you were poor and you had no place to sleep, you could go rent a space on a bench with a bunch of strangers. And what they would do is they would drape a rope across in front of the bench, and you could suspend yourself from the rope and sleep like that. And so when morning came, they would drop the rope and everyone would flop down. That's why it's called a flop house. It became a colloquial term for, you know, a place where you go because they were so common. You know, the trope of the guy boiling a shoe for food, as the leather of his shoe for food, you know, with the bindle stick and stuff like that. That was a real thing. The hobos, the migrant workers in the wake of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression was a real thing, right? So our language is rife with all these struggles of people who've gone through it because the power of labor has been diminished so severely that people are truly abjectly struggling by the masses, right? And there's a continual balance throughout history, throughout all of history, where the powered, moneyed capital class is trying to squeeze as much out of their workers as they can without making them squeal too much. Sometimes they screw up and they squeal too much, or sometimes something happens that gets them all riled up. Karl Marx writes a book or something like that. And the United States breaks away. Maybe we can do it too in France, you know, that kind of thing. Uh, they are always trying to get as much surplus value out of your labor as possible. We're trying to get as much surplus capital out of the capitalists as possible to find some sort of peaceable accord. And when I came of age was a time when labor had the power. You could They needed people on phones. They needed people working these computers. They needed people programming. These new businesses were firing up. Blah 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 blah. The dot-com boom was crazy. I was When I was working at the AV place, I went to set up something at one of these dot-com places. At 10 o'clock in the morning, they were drinking Dom Perignon champagne. They had that stuff available for anyone to drink at any time in this office. Bottles and bottles of $100 champagne. That's how they were spending their money so decadently in the 90s. When the money's flowing like that, of course, things are going to be great for everybody at the bottom. They're like, oh my gosh, all this crumbs from the feeding frenzy that's going on. I feel full. That's what's happening. But of course, the dot-com bust comes. One of the things I remember about that too, I was actually heading for a job interview. This was in year 2000. It was winter of 2000 or 1999. It was right before the dot-com bust. I was going for a job interview for Novo Nordisk, who's a pharma company, which is definitely like one of those stocks that do this number, you know, depending on whether or not they get their approval for their new radical drug or not. But I didn't quite understand this business process really when I went to this interview. But what was really wild was I was listening to the radio, which what people did back in ye olden times. And on the radio, they were interviewing this kid. He was an investor. He was like 11 or something. He was a young kid. And of course, they were like, you know, hey kid, you know, what's your favorite stock? And this kid was sharp as hell. He knew a lot of stuff and he had a lot of thought and done research and had read history and stuff. And one of the things he said as I was driving into this interview, he says, sooner or later, probably sooner, what's going to happen is people are going to stop putting all this money in and they're going to say, how am I going to get money back out? How is this making money? How is this making a profit? They're going to say that. And once that tidal shift happens, the market's going to collapse. That's what's going to happen. I don't know how bad that's going to be, this kid says, you know, but historically, what's happening is we're going through a boom, a frothy one at that. And it's the chickens are going to come home to roost sooner or later. It has to happen. That's the equilibrium. This 11-year-old kid on the radio. And I thought about that. I couldn't let go of it. To this day, I remember it years later. driving into this interview, and I asked him exactly that. I'm like, how are you guys going to make a profit? What's your goal for making money? And it's all pie in the sky. They had no real plan. It's just we're going to grow as big as possible and dominate as much of this market as we can while the getting's good. No foresight. I did not proceed with that particular job, and I'm glad I didn't. I went and worked for the government because I also saw the writing on the wall. And I was like, and I even thought at the time, maybe I'm making a huge mistake. All these guys, I knew a guy who was working at Mindscape, an internet provider, who said, "Oh, I plan to retire by the time I'm 30," you know. And I remember he was 24 or something, 23 at the time, and I remember working at the government. I got my safe government job, and I thought, oh man, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should get one of these companies with the stock options and stuff. 6 months later, that guy was calling me up like, "Hey, is there any work there?" I'm like, "Sorry, bro, the government's full," you know. I saw that writing on the wall thanks to that kid, and I took the safe option, and it worked out for me. But those opportunities that I had in the 90s, they don't exist at all anymore. Not one iota of anything like it. It's all been offshored, and now it's getting turned into AI. When I look at jobs in my career field, it's very uncommon for anything less than 7 years. Now, granted, I'm specializing in a particular technology, so there's not a lot of people who know what I do. But this is something I'm hearing from a lot of people in a lot of different industries. They're like, they want you to have 10 years of experience, 15 years of experience for this stuff, and then they want to pay you poverty wage, whatever. Labor doesn't have nearly as much power 30 years later here than they did when I entered the working world. And it shows, especially these last 15 years. I've never made as much money as I did in 2010. That is a fact. And while I still make well above the median income of the average citizen in the United States, it's getting harder. It's getting harder each and every year. I can't imagine how people are making it on less than average. That is, I mean, 40, 50, 60% of your income must go to rent by itself. You know, living three to an apartment and all that stuff, four to an apartment, five to an apartment, whatever people are doing. They're having to make ends meet in ways that we didn't have to. So I'm not being a romantic when I say that. My first apartment, now granted it was somebody's house. I lived in the sectioned off area. It was an apartment truly, but it was 400 and I think it was $450 a month. And I was earning $9 an hour. Now, it was a considerable portion of my income, but it was $450 a month. You can't even get a room for $450 a month in Charlotte. I'm not talking about Seattle. God forbid Seattle. You know, but rents here for a one-bedroom apartment is you're lucky to get up for under $1,000 now. You know, and the minimum wage is still $7.25. So we are I'm old enough now and have paid enough attention to know that we are falling behind in terms of our productivity and how we're um, how the fruits of our labor are being distributed, because there's a lot of money in this country. All you have to do is go into any major city and look at these massive skyscrapers built of steel and glass, and they're building new ones all the time, and giant data centers that are out in the middle of nowhere so you don't see them. Huge Amazon warehouses shipping stuff all over the place. you know Giant stadiums filled with people paying $2,000-$3,000 a seat to see their favorite local sports franchise. There's a lot of money out there. There is. So the real simple distillable conclusion you can make from that is that if you're hurting, it's because you're not getting a decent share of the pie. And the reality is, labor has been getting less and less of a share of the pie, and they're hiding it with things like inflation. So yeah, you got a raise for 3%, but everything costs 10% more this year or whatever, right? Feels like you're making money. The numbers go up, but your buying power goes down, right? It's part of the smoke and mirrors. We can get into the Federal Reserve and all that other stuff, but it's not really what this is about. You got this frog in a kettle problem where they got the heat on just high enough that you're not squawking and not noticing what's going on. They're squeezing as much as they can out of you and doing whatever they can to get as much as they can, without regard to the greater society at large. And they're protecting themselves. They're building bunkers and hiring huge security firms and all this other stuff because they know the crowd is starting to get upset. They're starting, rather than collectively act as wealthy cabal that they are and say, okay, how do we keep the peasants happy? Let's give them double their wages now. We've made all this productivity. Let's give them some. They're not going to do that. You do it. I'm not going to do that. I'm keeping mine. You know. Ironically, one of the few times that actually worked out was in the panic of 1907. 1909, I think. 1907, 1909. JP Morgan, as the economy is collapsing because there was no central bank at the time, gets all his fellow bankers into a room, locks their asses in, and says, we're all putting a pound of flesh on this table because we're all saving this system because we're all invested in it. And some of these guys were like, no, man, when that guy over there implodes, I'm going to work out like a bandit. I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to profit from this situation. And JP Morgan's like, no, you're not. You are not. We are all going to pony up here so we all survive because the system's going to break. You're going to be a lord over nothing is what's going to happen. And if I'm still standing, I'm going to make it hell on you to continue doing business in this country. So when the wealthy work in their own interests for the masses, they tend to pull things together. But even then, that's capitalism, securing capitalism. It's not really securing labor rights. When people are out there saying, I don't want my 8-year-old child in mines and getting crushed because they're children and not understanding how this stuff works, and they should be in school so that they can maybe have a better life than working in a coal mine, they get violent. The wealthy class does. I don't like it when you talk about stuff like that. You know, Occupy Wall Street, right in the shadow of the banks. You have to look at this mob saying, we want more of this money. Hit them with a fire hose. Get them out of here. It's a sanitation issue. Those unwashed hippies, you know. But the level of disdain that they have for labor is commensurate with how much strength labor has. And we win little battles like getting Memorial Day observed after some of us get killed. And that's what it took to have the weekend that we're looking forward to here in a few hours. So I would like to reclaim May Day as Labor Day in the United States, warts and all, because it also reminds us, it should remind us, that it takes, sadly, most often, a blood sacrifice to make these things happen for the average person. You have to get out there and stand up. You have to say, I'm not going to take this anymore. And most recently, at a place my contract ended. I wasn't laid off. It's more accurate. But the layoffs came in because some private equity firm came in and they said, we can squeeze more out of these people. We can squeeze more out of this company so we can sell it like a hot potato. It's just a financial game to them. They don't care about you. They don't care about any of these workers. And they come in and they say, we're going to start laying people off. The time to band together as workers was right then. Say, no, you're not. You know what? No, you're not. We're not going to do a single lick of work for you until we have an agreement about how this company is going to be run in a way that is equitable for everyone. They didn't do that. They did not do that. They got together to clap with their little Teams messages and to tell the CEO, the new CEO, she's got a tough job. You know, I don't envy you and having to tell all these people they're getting laid off. She's a hatchet, man. Why are you siding with her? Because you're hoping that you'll survive the axe. I get it. I do. United we stand, divided we fall. My friends? And right now we're very divided. They like keeping us divided. They do. They like the status quo. They like us arguing over stuff like, oh, my tax dollars are going to feed that other person. So now it's between me and you. The fact that that guy's not paying any taxes at all, or certainly a smaller percentage than most of us hoi polloi at the bottom of this, we don't think about that because we're too busy thinking about this other person. It's when you start looking up. That's when the gas comes out. That's when the dogs get sicked on you, the fire hoses, tear gas, and batons. And I'm not advocating violence, man. I like the Nelson Mandela thing where dude just gets into power and shit changes. Not to say that there wasn't, you know, civil unrest as part of that, but that's about as smooth as you can ask for in terms of what needed to happen for the people at that time. And I don't see that mechanism working. All the levers and knobs that we have as the common people are broken off. And when they do that, the only way to do the only thing left to do is to topple the machine over. And they know it. History has told us that. And they think they can avoid it. I'm not sure how, but I just foresee trouble coming. And I hope that enough people become aware enough of what's happening and get involved enough and vocal enough to make the people who are in power worried enough about losing their own power that they'll start accommodating our needs. That's the most peaceful option you can hope for. And I hope that's how it works out. But I don't see them giving up anytime soon. And we'll have to fight these battles all over again. Maybe in my lifetime, maybe not. But until we do, it's only going to get worse. That's what I believe. But I believe in the long term, we will progress. If we don't kick ourselves alive on this planet first. It's always that's a new concern for the modern era too. God, are we going to even make it? First nuclear war, nuclear holocaust was our concern in the Cold War, and now this. Oy. Yeah. And then the existential crisis of AI. What a world we live in, boy. What a world we live in. Let's not forget our own humanity, though. We all got to eat. And it's hard to pay attention to how we got to where we are if the system is what's doing it to us. You know, and there are plenty of voices out there that tell you, you could do it. Oh, don't blame the system. The system is great. It's not great. If Jeff Bezos, that clown with the 10-gallon hat that raced his way into space against Elon Musk, is the face man for humanity's accomplishments right now, I think we can do better. If Donald Trump, bankrupted businessman and TV actor, is the best we can elect, is who we choose, we can do better. We can. I don't know how we fix it. That's the problem. And I know what history tells us. So, but here's to hoping. Here's to hoping that Labor Day means something and that we can remember and maybe push back a little bit and get a little bit back of what we've lost.